Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to continue our discussion on feeding relationships by really driving now into these ideas of food chains and food webs. So, a food chain really is just a simple model that shows how matter and, more importantly, how energy moves through an ecosystem. And it's really these sequences of linking one species to the next by their feeding relationships. So when we look at a food chain, we're really diving into just one connection from one species to the next. And when we look at those, the arrows that are used always point to the organism that is receiving the energy, or who is doing the eating. So when I look here down at our primary producers here in this aquatic food chain, these guys are organisms that are capable of doing things like photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. These are our autotrophs. So they're at the base of our food chain being eaten by the krill. So the krill is taking the energy from here and into itself when it consumes those algae. The krill then gets eaten by the cod, so the energy moves from that krill to the cod. The energy then moves from the cod to the leopard seal when that leopard seal eats that cod. And finally, the energy from the leopard seal gets consumed by the killer whale. So each link in a food chain we talk about as a trophic level. And every trophic level represents a particular feeding step or a transfer of energy and matter within the ecosystem. So that grass would be at one trophic level, the desert cottontail would be a different trophic level, the hawk would be yet another trophic level. So there are three total trophic levels in this particular example of a food chain. Here's just another example, right? So in comes the energy from the sun. The producers in our form of grass here are taking in that energy, converting it into usable cellular energy that then gets consumed by the primary consumer, our grasshopper, who then gets eaten by the snake. And so the energy transfers from there again as our secondary consumer. And then finally, our tertiary consumer, or our hawk, takes in that final bit of energy. Some additional energy gets fed to our decomposers, and then that decomposer's job, in this case the fungi, are responsible for moving the nutrients, the compounds, back to the grasses to be able to be reused. But the energy stops here. All right, so although that we're seeing recycling of nutrients here, there is no recycling of energy here. Now, when we look at ecosystems, the reality is that food chains in and of themselves are a very simplistic version of what is actually happening in an ecosystem. It is incredibly rare where you have a single species eating a single food source. Instead, you get much more of an interwoven web. And so a food web is designed to show all, or at least most, of the possible feeding relationships in a community at each trophic level, at least for the organisms that they have chosen to illustrate within that food web model. So it's really a network of interconnected food chains. It's incredibly more complex because it's now showing more biodiversity. And the more biodiverse that ecosystem, the more stable that ecosystem. And the good news is that if a single food source were to disappear, there should be other possibilities for those organisms to continue to get the energy and nutrients that they need. So it is very rare, once again, to see a single situation where one animal, or one organism for that matter, is solely dependent on a single food source. We don't see a whole lot of specialists, um, simply because the organisms shift, they move, extinction occurs, habitat destruction occurs, whether it's natural or man made. And so the evolution of these organisms wouldn't be particularly beneficial, to have evolved a bunch of specialists. Instead, most species are more on the generalist side of thing and eat multiple things as a way of ensuring their survival as ecosystems change. So when we look at these trophic levels, right, we typically talk about stepwise progressions. So you will get all of your producers at the bottom. The next level, or the second trophic level up from that, is going to be all of your primary consumers. These are overwhelmingly herbivores because they will eat those producers, those first trophic level organisms. Your secondary consumers then are third trophic level up, and these can be carnivores or omnivores, whether or not they, in general, strictly stick to eating meats, or do they eat a mixture of meats as well as plants. Um, and then your tertiary consumers, your fourth level trophic levels, again, can be carnivores or omnivores as well that are eating specifically those secondary consumers. Now, what I'm going to do here is throw in a quick caveat. When we talk about trophic levels, primary, secondary, tertiary consumer, you have to travel through a very specific food chain when you're labeling that, generally speaking. Um, because you certainly can have situations where if I have an omnivore, for example, who can eat both plants and animals, depending on which level or which food chain I follow within that complex food web, that omnivore could be in a particular situation a primary consumer if they're eating the plants, or they could be a secondary or even tertiary consumer if they're eating other animals, and where does the animal that they're eating fall within that food chain as well. So we have to be very specific when we're using these terms, in terms of what is eating what, and what are we particularly focused on. So just something to be mindful of. So remember, we always follow the arrows to what's being eaten, what's doing the eating, I should say, and where the energy is flowing, so that we can properly label who in that particular part of the food web at that period of time, as we're tracing that energy, where do they fall within these trophic levels. So again, just sort of giving you this very simplistic idea here that food chain is just one piece of a food web. So we see the grasses, we see the grasshopper, we see the mouse, we see the owl, but they are definitely part of a much more complex system. Uh, and that's what we're seeing with those food webs. And to be real, those food webs that we see, whether or not in textbooks and test questions, or even within legitimate scientific research, are rarely taking into consideration absolutely every potential feeding relationship in that ecosystem. They're assuming that it's a relatively stable, biodiverse ecosystem. Mapping all of that would be quite complex. And so they will tend to focus on just ones that are specific to whatever scientific question, scientific inquiry they are currently engaged in. Again, some more examples. So this one's of a desert ecosystem. We can see a lot of those primary producers, cacti, sagebrush, flowers there at the bottom. In this case, those main plant eaters are our primary consumers. Things like insects and lizards are kangaroo rats. Small predators, insectivores, show up as our secondary consumers, tarantulas, scorpions, snakes. And then you get your larger top predators as those tertiary consumers, that hawk and that kit fox there at the top. And again, just another example here where we're looking at a forest biome, and you can see some of the primary producers, primary consumers, secondary and then tertiary consumers up the food chain as we work through the web that is a temperate rainforest. And finally, here's yet another one. But if you notice consistently, the biggest thing is you've got to follow the arrows. Where do the arrows point? They always point to the organism that is doing the eating and in the direction that the energy is flowing. And one more, just our soil food webs. Again, you can take a look at these. They're broken out based on different trophic levels and what those guys are doing, as well as following the arrows in the food chain itself. So one of the things that we can look at in terms of stability and health of an ecosystem when looking at these food webs and food chains and determining trophic levels is this idea of biomass. What is the actual amount of organic matter that is in that habitat? And so what we really are doing is taking all of the mass of all of the organisms at every trophic level and comparing that mass from one trophic level to the next. How much of that mass is being moved along with the energy. And really that comes down to a big important indicator that is this idea of primary productivity. So this is the rate at which producers, right? These are the autotrophs. These are the ones who can take in things like sunlight and do photosynthesis to make energy for themselves that then gets passed up the ecosystem or up that food chain. Primary productivity is the rate at which producers in an ecosystem build biomass or just surely build the amount of different organisms that exist at this trophic level. And this is going to determine the maximum amount of energy that is available to all of the trophic levels above it, because they are the only ones who are capable of taking an inorganic source of energy and converting it into an organic one. And everything above them in a food chain or a food web is going to be dependent on organic forms of energy. So each time that energy is transferred, that energy gets converted. And some of that energy is being used by the organism itself to do its own sustaining processes. Some of that energy is ultimately going to be transferred up to the next trophic level, and some of that energy ends up getting lost as heat to the environment. Every time we change from one trophic level to the next, there's less energy available at that next trophic level because of the loss of heat, the usage by the previous organism, so on and so forth. So as we move up those food chains, both available energy and the actual biomass decrease. Okay, so not only does the amount of energy decrease, but the amount of physical matter of and number of organisms decreases as we go. So energy that's transferred up, it does move, but it gets diminished with every transfer. And so there's sort of this golden rule. It's not perfect, but it's a decent estimate for most collective ecosystems and most collective food chains, and that is about 10% of the energy is available at each tier or from one transfer to the next. Most of the energy is either being used by the previous organism or lost as heat to the environment. So when I go from producer to primary consumer, only 10% of the energy gets moved. So if I have 100% of the energy here, I'm now down to only 10% of the energy available for those primary consumers to consume and use. I go from that primary consumer to a secondary consumer, I now only move again another 10%. So if I had 100% here, 10% here, I'm now down to a single percent of the energy totally available within the ecosystem for those secondary consumers. Move it one more time to a tertiary consumer, and now again, only 10% of what was here moves here, which means now I'm down to 1/10 of a percent of energy that was totally available down here in that producer level. And so this is why your food chains aren't an infinite number of levels. I can't have 100 levels in a food chain. There just isn't enough energy being moved from that primary productivity in those producers at the bottom up to those top level consumers at the end of the food chain. And so most ecosystems only have enough primary productivity, enough biomass built within the producers in that environment to sustain maybe 4 to 5 levels max, including themselves. And fewer levels there are, the larger the number of organisms that you'll see at the top end. So again, here's just another really simplistic way to look at this. So your producers, again, will have something like 100% of the biomass available, amount of energy available, because they're the ones being able to take in the energy from the sun and convert it into chemical energy that other living things can use, including themselves. We'll move up 10% here. Now I've only left with 10% of what was down here in my herbivores or primary consumers. Secondary consumers come in, I'm now down to a single percent of the energy that was initially available in those producers. Tertiary consumer, I'm now down to 0.1 or 1/10 of a percent of energy left here that was originally produced by those producers down there at the bottom. Here's just another way to look at it. So there's that percentage again. just to show you that every time I do this, the amount of energy and the amount of biomass, the actual total number of organisms, decreases each time I go up a trophic level because I need enough energy to be a top predator, right? I need enough energy to be able to function at that level. And we start getting past two, three, four, maybe five levels, and there just isn't enough energy to sustain that top end. And so you often end up seeing them as pyramids, where the producers make up the base of the pyramid because there are just so many of them, and that is the primary reservoir for all the energy in the ecosystem, and it gets smaller and smaller both in the amount of available energy as well as the number of organisms as we move up. As a result, to just kind of piggyback this discussion, it's an interesting thing to think about the amount of energy that we get from eating plants as opposed to eating meats. You are actually being much more environmentally sustainable and gaining more energy by eating a bunch of fruits and vegetables, because those are coming from primary producers, than you are by eating a cow or a pig or something like that, eating those meat products, because now you're eating further up the food chain, which is kind of an interesting idea. So we've got to move that energy and move that biomass now, not only from the plants to you, but from the plants to that cow, for example, to you. So in the case of eating that big garden salad, you're now picking up 10% of the energy from the producer. So you're actually getting 10% of the energy. Where eating those meat products, like your cheeseburger, for example, means that I have to move that material from the plants into the cow and then from the cow to you. And so now you're only getting access to 1% of the original energy that was available in that ecosystem from those plants. So it's kind of an interesting thought experiment.